Welcome to Don't Beat the System, Greet the System. It's the Chet System Podcast, also known as the ChetPod SystemCast. Welcome, everyone who has already magically followed before the first episode to the very first episode. We're happy to have you here, and I'm going to say hello to you. Thank you for joining us on the ChetPod SystemCast. It's really great to have you, and these days we're all trying to express ourselves, and I had to go underground for a little while. Rumors of my death may have been exaggerated, but here I am, back in reality, back to discuss with you all the things that are going on in the world, and to share my insights from my time in the Powers Group. So today we're going to look at something I think is really important, which is the wisdom of a billionaire. If you can't trust a billionaire, can you really trust anyone? After all, they've done all the hard work to get themselves up into that place in society. Therefore, they know best. You can always apply what's known as Worthington's Law, which means the more money you have, the better your opinion is. Therefore, taking that into consideration, we can look at any billionaire's advice as being sacrosanct, as if they were not quite the new priests of the world order, but sort of the oracles. Let's say they tend to see trends coming ahead. So in that vein, we thought that we would look at one particular billionaire, who's, I believe, only the 79th richest person on the planet, but his name is Ray Dalio, and he has an extensive history as a hedge fund manager and also as an author. And of course, as many billionaires do, they have ideas that they'd like to put forth into the world, and some of them write books, and some of them make cartoons. Today we're going to take a look at a cartoon that Ray Dalio had produced, which is based on his book that's entitled Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order. We'll also be providing some commentary on the cartoon. It's really a video, and we'll be stopping it when necessary to provide that analysis and commentary. So if you want to check out Ray Dalio, you can Google his name, find his book on Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, and please keep in mind that this perspective you'll be seeing is the perspective of a billionaire who has analyzed and benefited from the system. So keep that in mind, and we'll start going with this video.
The Changing World Order. The times ahead will be radically different from those that we've experienced in our lifetimes, though similar to many times before. How do I know that? Because they always have been. Over my roughly 50 years of global macroeconomic investing, I've learned the hard way that the most important events that surprised me did so because they never happened in my lifetime. These painful surprises led me to study the last 500 years of history for similar situations, where I saw that they had indeed happened many times before, with the ups and the downs of the Dutch, British, and U.S. empires. And every...
So one thing I'll remark on right away is he's talking about how history repeats, and those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. That seems to be, macroeconomically at least, the lesson for the mass populace, is we don't remember history, we don't remember events that we haven't experienced directly, and therefore we don't always learn the lesson of past history in our lifetime, and therefore people may or may not set themselves up to capitalize on this repeating cycle that Mr. Dalio is going to get into. So here we go.
time they did, it was a sign of the changing world order. This study taught me valuable lessons that I'm going to pass along to you here in a distilled form. You can find the comprehensive version in my book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order.
Why Nations Succeed and Fail. We will be pausing to discuss some of the lesser-known possible blind spots that aren't covered in this video, ones that operate in the background but are still parallel to all the machinations that enable this cycle to continue and perpetuate. So we'll interject when we feel it's appropriate.
Let me begin with a story that brought me to this point, about how I learned to anticipate the future by studying the past. In 1971, when I was a young clerk on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, the United States ran out of money and defaulted on its debts. That's right, the U.S. ran out of money. How? Well, back then, gold was the money used in transactions between countries. Paper money, like the dollar, was like checks in a checkbook in that it had no value other than it could be exchanged for gold, which was the real money. At the time, the United States was spending a lot more money than it was earning by writing a lot more of these paper money checks than it had gold in the bank to exchange for them.
This is also known as debt as money. Essentially, paper notes are like IOUs, where you can exchange them for precious metals or a commodity of value. So he's talking about the gold standard and how that eventually becomes the petrodollar.
People turned these checks into the bank for gold money, the amount of gold in the U.S. started to dwindle. It soon became obvious that the U.S. couldn't keep its promises for all the existing paper money, so people holding dollars rushed to exchange them before the gold ran out. Recognizing that the U.S. was going to run out of real money, on Sunday evening, August 15th, President Nixon went on television to tell the world that the U.S. was breaking its promise to let people exchange their dollars for gold. Of course, he didn't say it that way. He said it more diplomatically, without making it clear that the United States was defaulting.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
I watched.
Well, that's pretty convenient. 1971 was quite a pivotal year for the world. I highly suggest once you're done this podcast, you go into your browser and type in www.wtfhappenedin1971.com. WTFHappenedin1971.com has a comprehensive and extensive list of all the wild changes that happened in the United States and throughout the world in the year of 1971. It's quite fascinating, and I highly suggest it.
In awe, realizing that money as we understood it was ending. What a crisis.
Not manufactured crisis at all, though.
Expected the stock market to plunge the next day, so I got on the exchange floor early to prepare. When the opening bell rang, pandemonium broke out, but not the kind I expected. The market was up, way up, and went on to rise nearly 25%. That surprised me because I never experienced a currency devaluation before. When I dug into history, I discovered that the exact same thing happened in 1933 and had the exact same effect. Then paper dollars were also linked to gold, which the U.S. was running out of because it was spending more paper money checks than it had gold to exchange for them. And President Roosevelt announced on the radio that he would break the country's promise to exchange dollars for gold.
It was then that I issued the proclamation providing for the national bank holiday. And this was the first step in the government's reconstruction of our financial and economic fabric.
I like decrees by proclamation. I think that's the kind of royalty you want to get back to, where you just say, I said it, therefore it's law.
The second step, last Thursday, was the legislation promptly and patriotically passed by the Congress, confirming my
Promptly and patriotically passed by Congress. Say that 14 times fast.
proclamation and broadening my powers so that it became possible, in view of the requirement of time, to extend the holiday and lift the ban of that holiday gradually in the days to come. This law also gave authority to develop a program of rehabilitation.
In both cases, breaking the link to gold allowed the U.S. to continue spending more than it earned, simply by printing more paper dollars. Since there was an increase in the number of dollars without an increase in the country's wealth, the value of each dollar fell. As these new dollars entered the market, without a corresponding increase in productivity, they went to buy lots of stocks, gold, and commodities, and hence caused their prices to rise. As I studied more history, I saw that the exact same thing happened many, many times before. I saw that since the beginning of time, when governments spent much more than they took in taxes, and conditions got bad, they ran out of money and they needed more. So they...
That's called quantitative easing. And the end result of that will be your lifestyle, resulting in a qualitative easing.
printed more, a lot more, which made its value fall and made the prices of most everything, including stocks, gold, and commodities, rise.
Remember, it's the perceived value that's rising. It's actually just taking more of the same dollars to buy the same stuff.
That's when I first learned the principle that when central banks print a lot of money to relieve a crisis, buy stocks, gold, and commodities because
prices are going up, because each dollar is now becoming worth even less. Thank you, inflation, the hidden tax.
their value will rise and the value of paper money will fall. This printing of money is also what happened in 2008 to relieve the mortgage-driven debt crisis,
Which was created by the banks and hedge fund managers and people betting against the system, essentially, but also packaging collateralized mortgages, most of which were garbage mortgages, so they wouldn't be repaid, and selling them as AAA investments. So that was kind of manufactured, but you know, occasionally we pull one off.
and in 2020 to relieve the pandemic-driven economic crisis, and it almost certainly will happen in the future. So I suggest that you keep this principle in mind. These experiences gave me another principle, which is to understand what is coming at you, you need to understand what happened before you.
I think that's known as those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So go read some books, go learn some history, figure out what happened in the past, and that'll help you decode what happens in the future. That's why it's called the futures market. And you'll notice that there's a lot of lessons, hence this video covering them on a macro level.
That principle led me to study how the Roaring Twenties bubble turned into the 1930s depression, which gave me the lessons that allowed me to anticipate and profit from the 2007 bubble turning into the 2008 bust. All these experiences led me to develop an almost instinctual urge to look to the past for similar situations to learn how to handle the future well.
And how do we look to the past, the pre-internet, pre-media past? Well, through those dusty old moldy books, some books that are reprinted from ages ago, and occasionally some books from ages ago that still survive to this day. And through them, you can reconstruct the storyline and all its threads to get a more accurate picture of what's really going on.
Changing orders. Over the last few years, three big things that hadn't happened in my lifetime prompted me to do this study. First, countries didn't have enough money to pay their debts, even after lowering interest rates to zero, so their central banks began printing lots of money to do so. Second, big internal conflicts emerged due to growing gaps in wealth and values. This showed up in political populism and polarization between the left, who want to redistribute wealth, and the right, who want to defend those holding the wealth. And third, increasing external conflict between a rising great power and the leading great power, as is now happening with China and the United States.
I just wanted to stop and interject with a huge apology for none of this being relevant to what's going on today. So, huge apology for that. Next time I'll try and focus on a more relevant video. Thank you.
So I looked back. I saw that all these had happened together before, many times, and nearly always led to changing domestic and world orders. The last time this sequence happened was from 1930 to 1945. What exactly is an order, you might ask? It's a governing system for people dealing with each other. There are internal orders for governing within countries, typically laid out in constitutions. And there is a world order for governing between countries, typically laid out in treaties. Internal orders change at different times than world orders, though whether within or between countries, these orders typically change after wars. Civil wars within countries, international wars between countries. They happen when revolutionary new forces defeat weak old orders. For example, the U.S. internal order was laid out in the Constitution in 1789 after the American Revolution, and it is still operating today, even after the American Civil War. Russia got rid of its old order and established a new one with the Russian Revolution in 1917, which ended in 1991 with a relatively bloodless revolution. China began its current internal order in 1949 when the Chinese Communist Party won the Civil War. You get the idea. The current world order
Yes, the New World Order. So, it's quite interesting that many of us have referred to the New World Order as if it is this group of secretive, shadowy people who are like, I'm with the NWO. And it's entirely possible that the New World Order is a new world order in which American dominance, the American century, is replaced by a century of another country who's a rising power. We won't name names, but I think you should get used to the beautiful color of crimson.
Commonly called the American World Order, formed after the Allied victory in World War II, when the U.S. emerged as the dominant world power. It was set out in agreements and treaties for how global governance and monetary systems work. In 1944, the New World Monetary System was laid out in the Bretton Woods Agreement and established the dollar as the world's leading reserve currency. A reserve currency is a currency that is commonly accepted around the world, and having one is a key factor in a country becoming the richest and most powerful empire.
Because everybody's got to use your money. It's your product, and if they got to use your money, then your money is worth a lot of money.
New dominant power and monetary system established, a new world order begins. These changes take place in a...
So it's a new world order. It's just when Jenga pieces just like climb on top of other Jenga pieces. That means there's no scary group to be worried about.
Timeless and universal cycle that I call the big cycle. I'll start with a quick overview, then give you a more complete version.
Oh, so the cycle between each cycle is two new world orders. And the rise leads to the top, and from the top you can only go down. So up and down the mountain we go.
And then direct you to my book if you want more. As
I receive nothing when you order his book. He has $1 billion. I no longer do.
studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies, it took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart.
Wait, what exactly denotes a plot point on the chart? I'm curious. I see linearly how you have the timeline, but the level relative to peak, what does that mean? What are the factors that go into where you chart on the chart? I'm hoping he will explain.
To understand China's patterns better, I also studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their monies back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese.
So important.
You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So how am I measuring an empire's power? In this study, I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency.
But not the honesty of their government or their intelligence agencies. I mean, how do you really measure that metric?
Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires. And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on.
The Wiggles are never confusing. The Wiggles are a fantastic children's band from Australia. You should check out the Wiggles. Oh, wait, so that's a different podcast.
Pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing, They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing.
I wonder what the reserve currency of the Galactic Empire from Star Wars is. I guess it's galactic credits, but what are they really based on? The force of violence or the threat?
At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually,
Those poor have-nots. Times are about to get inflated with challenges, if you know what I mean.
financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth.
I mean, that hasn't happened yet, so clearly that's not going to happen, as this is the one time where we've broken the cycle of history and we will be escaping the Matrix instead of being doomed to repeat it. So take comfort in that and continue to watch. If you don't mind, please give us a like on this video and also subscribe to our brand new channel. If you're watching this on YouTube, also like and subscribe. We really appreciate it. And of course, every subscribe and every like and every comment gets us one step closer to being reintegrated into the powers group where we can exert our benevolent influence. We thank you.
This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners.
Again, I wanted to apologize for showing a video of absolutely no relevance to any pre-existing conditions that are going on in the world stage today. So I hope you continue to watch, and my dearest apologies.
And losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order. And the cycle begins again.
And the cycle begins again. It's like the wheels of a machine that crush everything they drive over. But not really. It's a comfortable machine. It exercises soft power as long as you're not in that 10 to 20 year war period, because that part sucks for most people.
As I looked back, I saw that these cause and effect relationships drove the cycles of rises and declines.
Is it cause and effect, or is it correlation? It's probably cause and effect.
All the way back to the Roman Empire. I saw how the stories of each one of these cycles blended together with others before, during, and after, in the same way as each individual story blends with others to make the epic 500-year story that is our collective history. And
It sounds complicated, like Game of Thrones or something. Like you got to keep track of all these competing empires, and they're all doing machinations, and some of them are smuggling drugs on the side, and some of them are creating tax-exempt foundations to influence world events on the side, and others are, going into outer space to set up. Anyways, we're not going to get too much into it, but you can imagine that once you no longer have to worry about money, then you can focus your attention on more important things.
like human life cycles, no two are exactly the same, but most are similar. They're driven by logical cause and effect relationships
Like living to be 300 years old when you take adrenochrome.
that progress through stages from birth to strength and maturity to weakness and inevitably decline. However, that's like saying a person's life cycle takes 80 years on average, without recognizing that many are much shorter and many are longer. While age can be a good indicator of future longevity, a better way is to look at health indicators. One can do that with empires and their vital signs too. I found that by watching the indicators of power change, I was able to see what stage a country was in.
I like those indicators. Leadership capabilities, education levels, that's very important. Character and determination, so like the strength of your character. Are your people good? The rule of law, of course, you got to have good laws and people that obey those good laws. The level of corruption, the resource allocation efficiency, how much waste is going on, kind of ties into corruption if you think about it. And of course, the openness to global thinking, which really just means looking at all other cultures and determining best practices. The best thing is if we were able to shape countries with these sliders, it's kind of like a character creation screen in Elden Ring or any other RPG. If only it was so simple. I'm going to turn the corruption level down to low. We're going to turn the rule of law up really high, character determination really high. Look at this utopia we've created. It was so simple.
Which helped me to
just needed to get the right sliders going.
Anticipate what was likely to come next. Now, I'll take you through the big cycle in more detail. Give me 20 minutes, and I'll give you the last 500 years of history.
Sounds like a fair exchange. Why don't you give me 20 minutes times 2, and we'll take this journey together. And I'll do a little less of this cheeky commentary, and actually let you focus on the video. How does that sound?
And show you the similar patterns across the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese empires.
I still think he should include the Galactic Empire, just for reference.
500 years of big cycles. I'm going to describe the typical cycle by dividing it into 3 phases: the rise, the top, and the decline. The revolutionary leaders doing 4 things. First, they win power by gaining more support than the opposition. Second, they consolidate power by converting, weakening, or eliminating the opposition so they don't stand in their way. Third, they establish systems and institutions that make the country work well. And fourth, they pick their successors well, or create systems that do that. Because a great empire requires many great leaders over several generations. At this stage, soon after winning the fight, there is typically a period of peace and growing prosperity because the leadership is clearly dominant and has broad support, so no one wants to fight it. During this phase, leaders within the country have to design an excellent system to raise the country's wealth and power. First and foremost, to be great, they must have strong education, which is not just teaching knowledge and skills, but also strong character, civility, and work ethic. These are typically taught in the family, schools, and religious institutions. That provides a healthy respect for rules and laws, order within society, low corruption, and enables them to unite behind a common purpose and work well together. As they do this, they increasingly shift from producing basic products to innovating and inventing new technologies.
And of course, creating those new systems isn't just the work of a lot of people. It's the work of one man, me, Chet System. Just kidding, it is the work of a lot of other people. Quite a lot of other people, actually. And it's constantly refined and constantly rebuilt, and it just keeps evolving, I guess you could say. But these systems are what ensures that the person replacing the last person doesn't need to be too competent, because the system is the giant machine that just keeps going. And it's made up of smaller systems. It's pretty brilliant if you ask me, but I'm one of the designers, so of course I'm going to give myself one of these.
For example, the Dutch rose to defeat the Habsburg Empire and become superbly educated. They became so inventive that they came up with 1/4 of all major inventions in the world,
including the Dutch oven, don't forget.
Most important of which was the invention of ships that could travel around the world to collect great riches, and the invention of capitalism as we know it today to finance those voyages.
There you go. So if you don't like capitalism, blame the Dutch and their ovens and going Dutch. Going Dutch is capitalistic. Huh. I learned a new thing.
They, like all leading empires, enhance their thinking by being open to the best thinking in the world. As a result, the people in the country become more productive and more competitive in world markets, which shows up in their growing economic output and rising share of world trade. You can see this happening now as the U.S. and China are roughly comparable in both their economic outputs and their shares of world trade. As countries trade more globally, they...
I'm curious if it's the people that create the conditions or if it's the conditions that create the people and put them into a place where they are willing to work for less money because it's still a relative step up for them. You know, it's something to think about.
must protect their trade routes and their foreign interests from attack, so they develop great military strength. If done well, this virtuous cycle leads to strong income growth, which can be used to finance investments in education, infrastructure, and research and development. They must also develop systems to incentivize and empower those that have the ability to make or take wealth. In all of these cases, the most successful empires used a capitalist approach to develop productive entrepreneurs. Even China, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party, used a form of this capitalist approach. Deng Xiaoping, when asked about this, said, "It doesn't matter if it's a white cat or a black cat, as long as it catches mice. And it's glorious to be rich." To do this well, they must develop their capital markets. Most importantly, their lending, bond, and stock markets. That allows people to convert their savings into investments to fund invention and development.
Yes, that is a conversion. Because your savings is your accrued value. And I guess, let's invest it in stocks and bonds and other things. A lot of time, the little guy, it's a game that's a little bit bigger. But sometimes people make it through and their gamble pays off. However, the deck is often stacked. And whether that's by design or just the luck of the rich, we'll have to see.
And share in the successes of those who make great things happen. The Dutch created the first publicly listed company, the Dutch East India Company, and the
highly, highly recommend looking up the Dutch East India Company. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more, then you can check out episodes of Grand Theft World's podcast, where they cover many aspects of empire building, including the Dutch East India Company.
First stock market to fund it, which were integral parts of the system that produced massive wealth and power. As a natural consequence, the greatest empires developed the world's leading financial centers for attracting and distributing the world's capital. Amsterdam was the world's financial center when the Dutch were preeminent. London, when the British were on top. New York is now, and China is quickly developing its financial centers. Most importantly, the capitalists, the governments, and the military must work together. Not only did the Dutch work well together, they were one and the same. The Dutch East India Company was granted a trade monopoly from the government and had its own officially sanctioned military to go out into the global markets to make and take wealth. The British followed with the British East India Company and had a similar coordination of their government, business, and military operations. The U.S. military-industrial complex followed suit, as does the Chinese system today.
interesting that the religious power centers play absolutely no role, and neither do tax-exempt foundations or NGOs. Oh well, I guess they're just kind of skiing in the background.
As the country becomes the largest international trading empire, its transactions can be paid with its currency, making it the preferred global medium of exchange. And because their currency is so widely accepted and frequently used, people around the world want to save in it, making it the preferred storehold of wealth, and thus the world's leading reserve currency. The guilder was the world's main reserve currency when the Dutch led world trade, the pound was when the British led, and the dollar has been since the US led.
Well, there you go. So what about Bitcoin and its market cap? What about these other cryptocurrencies that are perceived stores of value? It's interesting to see the race for dominance in perceived value. So I like this video so far. Even if it oversimplifies some aspects, I feel like you could take a 1 to 2 minute chunk and do an entire episode on just those discussions. However, we're going to try and digest this in its entirety in this one session.
Naturally, China's currency is increasingly being used as a reserve currency. Having a reserve currency enables the empire to borrow more than other countries. That advantage is huge.
It's quite interesting when you think about the recent decoupling of Russia from the SWIFT system and the fact that if Russia moves over to China's UnionPay system and that UnionPay system has more adopters from other major countries, it could lead to a path where the SWIFT system is rendered less relevant or even obsolete, in which case sanctions performed by the West against Russia would actually backfire and create the conditions for a preeminent economic collapse. Of course, none of this is by design at all, I'm certain. Klaus Schwab.
Think about it. People all over the world are eager to save and hence lend back their currency to the empire. Countries without a reserve currency don't.
I'm eager to lend my money back to the empire. Aren't you? Investing in empire is a great investment. That's why on our next episode of the Chet System Podcast, we're going to discuss those wonderful vanguards of business, Vanguard, and also their best friend, BlackRock. We're going to be working on a children's book called Vanguard and BlackRock for kids so that they can better understand why these are two entities that they'll be praying to in the future, while those entities prey upon them.
Have that. And when the empire runs out of its own money, remember the United States in 1971?
Wah wah.
They can always print more. The exorbitant privilege afforded by the empire's reserve currency
Is that known as rich privilege?
leads borrowing to increase and the beginning of a financial bubble. This series of cause and effect relationships leading to mutually supportive financial, political, and military powers, bolstered by the borrowing power of a reserve currency, have gone together since history began to be recorded. All the empires that became the most powerful in the world followed this path to the top. While in the
Reaching for the top, you gotta reach for the top, baby. That's a song I just wrote during the commercial break, so I hope you enjoy it. It'll be on Spotify and Apple Music in about 30 seconds.
Phase, most of these strengths are sustained. Embedded within the fruits of their success are the seeds of their decline. As a rule, as people in these rich and powerful countries earn more, that makes them more expensive and less competitive relative to people in other countries who are willing to work for less. At the same time, people in other countries naturally copy the methods and technologies of the leading power, which further reduces the leading power's competitiveness. For example, British shipbuilders had less expensive workers than Dutch shipbuilders. So they hired Dutch designers to design better ships that were built by less expensive British workers, making them more competitive, which led the British to rise and the Dutch to decline. Also, as people become richer, they tend not to work as hard. They enjoy more leisure, pursue the finer and less productive things in life, and at the extreme become decadent. Values change from generation to generation during the rise to the top, from those who had to fight to achieve wealth and power to those who inherited it.
Oh my god. Did you? I don't think I was meant to be a part of this video, but I thought I saw a cartoon photo of myself sticking my tongue out. And I find that to be greatly offensive because they didn't include my name so people would know that that was me being a brat sticking my tongue out.
They're less battle-hardened, steeped in luxuries, and accustomed to the easy life, which makes them more vulnerable to challenges.
Also
the
true.
golden era of the Dutch Empire and
So wait, it sounds like what he's saying is that bad times breed hard men, and hard men face challenges, and challenges lead to strong men, and strong men lead to good times, but good times lead to weak men, and weak men lead to challenges, which then lead to challenging times, which then lead to strong men to overcome the challenges, which then leads to good times, which then leads to weak men, which then, wait, as if it's only men that do all of the things that are bad. If you talk about anything on a macro scale, you can only risk upsetting somebody or getting it wrong. Unless you're a billionaire, which is why this video is powerful.
the Victorian era of the British Empire were such high prosperity periods like this. As people get used to doing well, they increasingly bet on the good times continuing and borrow money to do that, which grows into financial bubbles. Naturally, the financial gains come unevenly, so the wealth gap grows. Wealth gaps are self-reinforcing because rich people use their greater resources to reinforce their powers.
Which means they can create other gaps, like knowledge gaps and, anything that conveys an advantage, while still marketing that the advantages belong to everyone. It's almost like PR, propaganda, and optics have evolved from being literal to more subtle over the last 120 years. Whether that's to maintain empire for longer or to make the swapping of empires a little more palatable, we'll soon see.
For example, they give greater privileges to their children, like better education, and they influence the political system to their advantage.
That's called grift? No, that's called greasing the skids. I think we can all agree that corruption's overstated, and it only is happening once it's exposed. Then that means it happened. But if it's not exposed, it's probably not happening, right? Right?
This causes the gaps in values, politics, and opportunities to grow between the rich haves and the poor have-nots.
Those poor have-nots!
Those who are less well off feel the system is unfair, so resentments grow. But as long as the living standards of most people are still rising, these gaps and resentments don't boil over into conflict.
I.e., as long as the chattel are comfortable in their prison cells, or let's call them stock pens, it sounds a little more palatable for the optics. As long as the chattel are comfortable in their stock pens with plenty of distractions and comforts and impulse control outlets, well, they'll put up with just about anything. History's definitely shown this.
Having the world's reserve currency inevitably leads to borrowing excessively and contributes to the country building up large debts with foreign lenders. While this boosts spending power over the short term, It weakens the country's financial health and weakens the currency over the long term. In other words, when borrowing and spending are strong, the empire appears very strong, but its finances are in fact being weakened. The borrowing sustains the country's power beyond its fundamentals by financing both domestic overconsumption and international military conflicts required to maintain the empire. Inevitably, the cost of maintaining and defending the empire becomes greater than the revenue it brings in, so having an empire becomes unprofitable.
Wait, so you're saying all these wars of aggression in the last 20 years, like the war on terror, wasn't profitable? I mean, yeah, taxpayer dollars and all that, but I'd like to think that Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and everyone else who's connected to any of those companies who were also in positions of government during the last 20 years probably made out pretty good for themselves. I mean, I'm hoping they did. Otherwise, what was it all for? At least somebody made a profit on all that blood and soil.
For example, the Dutch Empire overextended around the world and fought war after increasingly expensive war with the British and other European powers to protect its territory and trade routes. The British Empire similarly became massive, bureaucratic, and lost its competitive advantages as rival.
Wait, was that in South Africa? Was that Rhodesia? I mean, Zimbabwe? That could be something interesting that we could talk about in another episode.
Particularly Germany, soared, leading to an increasingly expensive arms race and world war. The U.S. has spent about $8 trillion on foreign wars and their consequences since September 11, and trillions more for other military operations and for supporting military bases in 70 countries. And it still isn't spending enough to support its military competition with China in the area around China.
Yeah, but I mean, someone's got to police the world, and what are you going to do, defund the global police? That's just redonkulous as a suggestion. There is a lot of places to set up missiles and station your guys, and a lot of money to be made in doing that. So, again, what people don't know can't hurt them. Oh, wait, but if people do know, then I guess it does kind of hurt them.
In this cycle, the richer countries eventually get deeper into debt by borrowing from poorer countries that save more. It's one of the early signs of a wealth and power shift. This started...
Then how rich were you to begin with? Is it wealth on paper if you're actually just in huge debt? I'm confused by all finances, and now I'm getting sleepy.
In the United States in the 1980s, when it had a per capita income 40 times that of China's, and started borrowing from Chinese who wanted to save in dollars because the dollar was the world's reserve currency. Similarly, the British borrowed a lot of money from its much poorer colonies, and the Dutch did the same at their top. If the empire begins to run out of new lenders, those holding their currency begin to look to sell and get out rather than to buy, save, lend, and get in.
Oh, so that's how Bernie Madoff did it. It's just like a whole government fleecing pyramid scheme. Oh, wait, I think I just broke my brain. If it's all a pyramid scheme, how? Just, you know what? Just forget you saw this part. Just skip ahead, or just I'll edit this part out of the stream. Because I don't know if I can handle that. So the big cycle.
The strength of the empire like begins to decline.
A curvy pyramid where wealth is generated on the labor of others, extracted in an increasing gap, and then the country is essentially pump and dumped. Hope I'm understanding that right. I'm trying to distinguish between when he says Britain, the Dutch, U.S., if he means the government strictly, or corporations, or the people, or a combination of all three, especially as things grow towards a more international flavor then what is the world order in that regard?
Decline. The decline. The decline comes from internal economic weakness together with internal fighting or costly external fighting or both. Typically, the decline comes gradually and then very suddenly.
Again, I know I've over-apologized for showing you a video that has no relevance to anything going on today. I humbly apologize once more.
When debts become very large, and there is an economic downturn, and the empire can no longer borrow the money necessary to repay its debts, the financial bubble bursts. This creates great domestic hardships and forces the country to choose between defaulting on its debts or printing a lot of new money. It always chooses to print a lot of new money, at first gradually and eventually massively. That devalues the currency and raises inflation.
But it's almost like the Federal Reserve doesn't exist in this scenario. I mean, central banks, but let's not name them in this. It's just, we had to print more dollars, and now your dollars are worth a little bit less. How are those food and gas prices?
For the Dutch, this was the financial crisis brought about by financial excesses and paying for the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. Similarly, for the British, it was paying for its financial excesses and its debts from the two world wars. And for the U.S., it's been 3 cycles of debt finance booms and busts since the 90s, with the central bank stepping in each time with stronger measures.
And remember, none of these were Ponzi schemes. None whatsoever. They are stumbling accidents that, whoops, we couldn't possibly have avoided these things. They were inevitable yet accidental, if that makes sense.
When the government has problems funding itself, when there are bad...
My money printing arm is getting tired. I cannot print. I've got tendinitis.
Economic conditions and living standards for most people are declining, and there are large wealth, values, and political gaps. Internal conflict between the rich and the poor, as well as different ethnic, religious, and racial groups.
Did you notice? They're not attacking him. They're fighting each other. Because, that's the easier choice.
Greatly increases.
They rise up.
This leads to political extremism that shows up as populism of the left or the right. Those of the left seek to redistribute the wealth, while those of the right seek to maintain the wealth in the hands of the rich. Typically, during such times, taxes on the rich rise, and when the rich fear their wealth...
My giant stack of paper notes. Please don't take it away and fund welfare programs and social systems.
And well-being will be taken away, they move to places, assets, and currencies they feel safer in. These outflows reduce the empire's tax revenue, which leads to a classic, self-reinforcing, hollowing out process.
Hollowing out. Again, none of this is like a pyramid scheme, and none of this is unsustainable. It's these cycles are what drive us to be more productive and efficient, and also concentrate wealth and power in the hands of the deserving. I mean, the effortacious, the merit and meritocracy. Merit is...
When the flight of wealth gets bad enough, governments outlaw it. Those seeking to get out begin to panic.
This in no way happened to me or anyone that I know ever in the last little while. So just ignore this part of the story or skip ahead. This is the fictional part that rarely occurs except for every cycle.
These turbulent conditions undermine productivity, which shrinks the economic pie and causes more conflict about how to divide the shrinking resources. Populist leaders emerge from both sides and pledge to take control and bring about order. That's when democracy is most challenged because it fails to control the anarchy, and it is when the move to a strong populist leader who will bring order to the chaos is most likely. As conflict within the country escalates, it leads to some form of revolution or civil war to redistribute wealth and force the necessary big changes.
Yeah,
This
I don't
can
know
be
about that.
peaceful and maintain the existing order,
It's,
but it's more often violent and changes the
I don't know about that. You rarely see the science officers turning on the red shirts and the security officers of the starships in Star Trek. So science officers, unless they have some sort of like parasitic worm that's affecting them psychically, will rarely attack red shirts. Usually the red shirts themselves are attacked by other aliens or suffer transporter malfunctions or some kind of accident like that. So I will take issue with how the previous portrayal between the blue shirts and red shirts is its existence is just it's not quite accurate.
For example, the Roosevelt Revolution to redistribute wealth was relatively peaceful and maintained the existing internal order, while the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution were much more violent and led to new internal orders. This internal conflict makes the empire weak and vulnerable to rising external rivals who, seeing this domestic weakness, are more inclined to mount a challenge. This raises the risk of great international conflict, especially if the rival has built up a comparable military. Defending oneself and one's empire against rivals requires great military spending, which has to occur as domestic economic conditions are deteriorating, and
it's not like you're going around creating rivals to justify military spending, because that would be a Ponzi scheme. That would be unsustainable, and billionaires don't create Ponzi schemes. They create only sustainable systems for the betterment of humanity.
empire can least afford it. Since there is no viable system for peacefully adjudicating international disputes, these conflicts are typically resolved through tests of power. As bolder challenges are made, the leading empire is faced with the difficult choice of fighting or retreating. Fighting and losing is the worst outcome, but retreating is bad too.
This game of Battleship is like a game of football where it's 0-0 after the third intermission, and they still haven't scored on each other, and they're just firing blanks on one another. I have to say, I've seen more exciting games of Battleship, and frankly, they really need to create, in order to rectify this situation, they need to create one global authority figure, possibly a bunch of scientists or aliens, or a mix of scientists and aliens that can govern and adjudicate with the wisdom of their scientism and their technocracy. I think that's going to be the only way to stop these ships from firing upon one another.
It cedes progress to the rival and signals that the empire is weak to those countries that are considering which side to be on. Poor economic conditions cause more fighting for wealth and power, which inevitably leads to some kind of war. Wars are terribly costly. At the same time, they produce the tectonic shifts that realign the new orders to the new realities of wealth and power in the world. When those holding the reserve currency and debt of the declining empire lose faith and sell them, that marks the end of its big cycle.
And remember, nobody who controls the currency markets has anything to do with the war markets. They are completely distinct and separate, and therefore there's no overlap, no conflict of interest, and definitely no Ponzi schemes going on here. There's just, if you're in the mood to ignore a book, I would highly suggest that you ignore this book. War is a Racket. After all, it's a fictional book, of course, written by a man I just made up named Smedley Butler, the Brigadier General, who I just invented at this moment. But if you choose not to read this book, War is a Racket, then I find you will sleep more comfortably. So swallow that blue pill and ignore this book's existence.
Of the roughly 750 currencies that existed since 1700, less than 20% now exist, and all of them have been devalued.
I think we need to stage some kind of environmental intervention for these currencies that are going extinct and currencies that are endangered. Because if we can't save the whale currencies or the dolphin currencies or the sloth currencies or the Dogecoin currencies, then who's going to care for the children's?
For the Dutch, this happened after their defeat in the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, when they weren't able to repay the massive debts they built up during it. This led to a run on the Bank of Amsterdam and a desperate sell-off, forcing massive money printing, which devalued the currency and the empire into irrelevance. For the British, this happened after World War II, when despite their victory, they could not repay the massive debts they borrowed to fund their war effort. This led to a series of money printing, devaluations, and sell-offs in the British pound as the US and the dollar emerged dominant and created a new world order.
And remember, the British banks and the City of London control absolutely nothing. It's not like N.M. Rothschild and Son sets the price of gold every day, or that these central banks have any influence over other central banks with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. It's just, sorry Britain, your time as the leader of the empire has ended. I also suggest that you do not look up Cecil John Rhodes or his Last Will and Testament or any of the roundtable groups created as a result of that Last Will and Testament, because you'll find it extremely boring and it'll put you to sleep, because history that's relevant, it's so tiring.
At the time of this recording, the United States hasn't yet reached this point. While it has massive debt, spends more than it earns, and funds this deficit with more borrowing and printing huge amounts of new money.
They haven't gone to war with Russia yet. That's the only thin strap. So that's not going to happen. That's not even on the table. And therefore all these other things that set up the exact fall of the American empire, completely irrelevant. And, you know, you have nothing to worry about other than getting Bitcoin and Dogecoin at a great price.
The big sell-off in dollars and dollar debt hasn't yet begun. And while there are great internal and external conflicts occurring for all the classic reasons, they've not yet crossed the line to become wars. Eventually, out of these conflicts, whether they're violent or not, come new winners who get together and restructure the losers' debts and political system.
Looks like a bunch of white hands to me. Those are probably all dudes over 85 years old, and they smell like they're over 85. Nothing to be ageist against those who are over the age of 85. You've definitely accrued an odoriferousness to you as you've continued to age and accrue parts of the earth as they cycle through your octogenarian bodies. So hence, of course, you're going to have the most amount of wisdom to write treaties like this and sign them with your crusty old white hands.
And establish the new world order. Then the old cycle and empire ends, and the new one begins, and they do it all over again.
I'm so glad someone put out a video this simplistic so that even a children's can do it. Even the children can understand it. Even the kids can understand. So you can teach them the New World Order. It's not a group. It's not a scary bunch of bad mans. The New World Order is it's the next one. It's Zion 7.0. Except there is no Neo to come and save the last Zion. It just kind of, the next cycle starts. And don't forget to buy those stocks and commodities.
That's a lot of detail I just threw at you to paint a picture of how the typical big cycle transpires.
Remember, these are the typical ones. There's atypical ones that also happen, but that's a whole other video that a trillionaire is going to have to produce because it's even more complex and it's going to need more attractive cartoon figures.
Of course, not all of them transpire in exactly this way, but most largely do. So much so that it seems like the stories of rises and declines stay essentially the same, and the only things that change are the clothes the characters wear and the technologies they use.
Because we're automatons, and human livestock and none of us have individual personalities. We are a collective of automatons and biological androids who exist to do the willing and the bidding of our billionaire masters. So I'm glad we've been able to look over a lesson on how we're comfortable and how these cycles will continue to perpetuate as long as we don't learn from them. I'm personally looking forward to the next cycle where we get to be serfs in a technocratic utopian dystopia, depending on how much of a zealot you are for the system, where the new god is government and the new priests are politicians and the billionaires are like the royalty who help perpetuate the cycle until that cycle comes to an end in the year 2170, I guess, or would it be 2270, which will be a new Star Trek series coming to you soon. Let's just finish off the last 4 minutes of this video.
So, where are we heading? The future. Most empires have their time in the sun and inevitably decline. Reversing a decline is difficult because that requires undoing a lot that's already been done, but it's possible. By looking at...
If corporate man has the powers of Superman, you can reverse a decline, even though it hasn't happened in history, and clearly you can't think of a lot of examples other than, nope, still having a lot of trouble. Maybe this time they'll get it right. They'll stop the decline, and everything will be saved by some kind of messianic figure who has the right character attributes to pull us out of this one. It definitely won't take the hard work of everybody learning and making the effort and coming to a collective realization of their own best interest. That just sounds like a whole lot of work, and I'm not sure. Are we cut out for it? Is humanity cut out for this? I mean, the one thing you notice in these cycles is that people keep on living. We keep on birthing. We keep on fighting. We just keep on keeping on. So unless we drive ourselves to like the worst kind of war, then maybe we'll just keep adjusting and learning to live with these new systems. Not Ponzi schemes. These are systems of wealth generation, and they take care of you, and in no way would Bernie Madoff sign off on any of
these
this.
indicators, it's pretty easy to see which stage of the big cycle an empire is in, how fit it is, and whether its condition is improving or worsening, which can help one estimate how many years it has left. Still, these estimates aren't precise, and the cycle can be extended if those in charge pay attention to their vital signs and improve them. For example, knowing that a person is 60 years old, how fit they are, whether they smoke or not, and a few other basic vital signs, one can estimate the person's longevity. One can do...
Wait, are they saying that America's a big fat smoker? Are you saying that I'm at risk of having a health issue and that my empire's gonna die down or something? Because I don't think I like that news. I think I'm gonna get a second opinion.
that with empires and their vital signs too. It won't be precise, but it will be broadly indicative and give clear direction on steps to take to increase longevity. It's most often the case that a nation's greatest war is with itself over whether or not it can make the hard decisions needed to sustain success. As for what we need to do, it comes down to just two things: earn more than we spend and treat each other well. All other things I mentioned, strong education, inventiveness, being competitive, and all the rest, are just ways of getting at these two things. It's easy to measure if we're doing them. So like people who want to get fit, let's get on the program and improve our vitals. Let's do that individually and collectively.
With a focus on collectively, not so much individually, because, individuals are selfish and freedom-loving and they kind of get in the way, and sometimes they're mavericks and sometimes they're rebels, and it's just they're not as predictable. So it would be better if you're more one of the predictable law and order following, hardworking but no expectation kind of people, because they're the most fun. I mean, easy to exploit or to utilize in the growth of the next empire. Remember, don't get rid of empires. Don't get rid of corruption and these other power centers. Don't decentralize. Make sure that we continue to centralize and just create a global empire, because that won't be a Ponzi scheme and will definitely guarantee the positive, biodiverse, biosecure future we all need and deserve.
My goal for sharing this picture of how the world works and a few principles for dealing with it well is to help you recognize where we are and the challenges we face, and to make the wise decisions needed to navigate these times well. Since there is a lot more to discuss and we are out of time, you can learn more in my book, Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order, and I look forward to continuing this conversation at economicprinciples.org.
I'm hoping if I read the book 20 more times that I will also have $1 billion. Is that realistic? I don't know. My mom said it's not realistic, but I mean, what does she know? She's my mom. Actually, she's more successful than I am. So maybe there is something to learn there. Economic principles, eh? Well, I wonder if the world's sustainable for all of us to be billionaires. Or if the only way we can all be billionaires is if we inflate the currency so that $1 billion is like $100. Then we all have $1 billion. And then we're billionaires. And then, oh wait, a cheeseburger will cost $3 billion though. Dang. Well, no easy solutions, but Chet System isn't really about solutions. It's about entertainment while you learn stuff, and hopefully making you laugh, making you groan, and letting you know that we are all owned.
And on social media. Thank you.
Don't forget to follow this billionaire guy on social media, Ray Dalio. He's one of the good billionaires, though. You don't have to worry. He's in the bottom 50 to 100. They're the good ones trying to get. As soon as you cross 50 to the top 50, then you become one of the baddies. So it's just that's the rule of the Billionaire 100. And I didn't write those rules. I just helped design systems to enforce them. So as he's saying thank you for watching, I will also say thank you for watching this inaugural episode of Don't Beat the System, Greet the System, the ChetPod SystemCast. We are really excited to be able to show you our next episode next week. We'll try and make this a weekly thing, and we will try and have guests on. We will discuss exciting, fun, provocative subjects and continue our analysis of current events, ideas, and occasionally people's work. So, well, thank you. To have a wonderful afternoon. Chet System says, we love everything that you do. Don't beat the system. Greet the system. We'll see you later. Take care. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.